3 days before my wedding, my mother canceled everything. The flowers, the catering, the venue. And then, as if humiliation itself needed an audience, she called my fiancé and told him, "My daughter is damaged goods, and you're making the biggest mistake of your life." I found out while standing in my apartment surrounded by unopened wedding gifts and half-written thank you cards. My phone buzzed nonstop, vendors apologizing, confused relatives asking questions, my bridesmaids panicking in the group chat. At first, I thought there had been some payment issue, some misunderstanding. Then I saw the screenshots. My mother had personally contacted every vendor, pretending to protect the family from embarrassment. She told them the wedding was canceled because the groom had changed his mind after learning the truth about me. The truth. That word sat in my chest like broken glass. Outside my window, rain tapped softly against the buildings, and I remember staring at the city lights while my fiancé, Daniel, stood frozen beside me with his jaw clenched so tightly. I thought his teeth might crack. He kept rereading her messages like his brain refused to accept them. "She wanted to destroy you," he whispered. "No, she wanted to destroy us publicly." And on the morning of our wedding day, 90 guests arrived dressed in silk and black tuxedos, only to find an empty dirt lot where our venue should have been. Folding chairs gone, decorations gone, no music, no ceremony, just confusion, and my mother standing there in a cream-colored dress with the faintest smile on her lips. What she didn't know was that my maid of honor had spent the last 2 weeks planning something far bigger than a wedding. My mother spent most of my life treating love like a transaction. If someone loved you, it meant they owed you obedience. If they disobeyed, you punished them until they came back smaller. I learned that before I learned multiplication tables. When I was 12, she threw away a sketchbook I'd spent a year filling because she said artists were women who failed at real life. When I got accepted into a graduate program, she told relatives, I only got in because the admissions office felt sorry for me after my father died. And when Daniel proposed, her first response wasn't congratulations. It was, does he know everything about you? Everything meant the car accident from 6 years earlier. The one that left a scar along my ribs and ended any chance of me having children naturally. My mother treated that private grief like spoiled inventory she needed to warn buyers about. But Daniel never looked at me like something broken. That confused her more than anything. People often mistook my silence for weakness because I rarely fought back publicly. I worked as a contracts attorney. I knew emotion made people careless. My mother, on the other hand, survived on spectacle. She liked scenes, tears, public humiliation. She wanted control so badly she mistook fear for respect. For years, I let her believe she was winning. So when she destroyed my wedding 3 days before the ceremony, she expected me to collapse the way I always had before. What she didn't realize was that this time, I wasn't alone anymore. The week before the wedding, my mother moved through every conversation like someone carrying a hidden blade. Small comments, quiet cuts. At my final dress fitting, she circled me slowly while the tailor pinned the hem. Her fingers brushed the fabric near my waist, and she gave a soft sigh that sounded almost sympathetic. Well, she said lightly, at least the dress distracts from the scar. The room went silent except for the clicking of pins dropping into a metal tray. Later that evening, during dinner with Daniel's parents, she smiled warmly while pouring wine and asked his mother, "Do you ever worry he's taking on too much emotionally?" The sentence floated across the table gently enough that anyone else might have missed the poison inside it. But I saw Daniel's hand tighten around his glass. So did she. That was the part she enjoyed. Most watching, people absorbed the insult before deciding whether to react. 2 days later, I arrived at the florist's studio and found the front display, already dismantled. White roses lay scattered across a work table like discarded paper. The owner avoided eye contact while explaining there had been a family emergency, cancellation request. I knew immediately. My mother had always preferred quiet sabotage over loud confrontation. Loud cruelty could be defended against. Quiet cruelty made people question their own instincts first. Even our relatives started behaving differently. Conversation stopped when I entered rooms. My aunt hugged me too tightly. Cousins exchanged awkward glances. Someone had clearly been talking. And through all of it, my mother remained perfectly calm. That terrified me more than anger ever could. The turning point came the night before the wedding. I was sitting on my apartment floor, surrounded by canceled contracts and unopened voicemail notifications, when my maid of honor, Serena, quietly placed a folder in front of me. Inside were printed emails, vendor confirmations, payment reversals, screenshots of messages my mother had sent pretending to act on my behalf. In one message, she called me emotionally unstable. In another, she warned guests that Daniel was having second thoughts and too embarrassed to admit it. But the last page made my stomach drop. It was an email to Daniel. She had attached medical records from my accident. Private records. My hands actually shook reading it. Not from sadness anymore, but clarity. For years, I kept believing there was some version of myself that could finally earn my mother's kindness. If I stayed patient enough, successful enough, quiet enough, that illusion died on my living room floor. Daniel sat beside me in silence for a long time before asking one question. What happens if we stop protecting her? Not confronting her, not exposing her out of rage, just stopping the protection. And suddenly, every moment of my life rearranged itself in my mind. All the excuses relatives made for her. All the times I minimized her behavior to avoid family embarrassment. I realized my silence had become part of her strategy. Serena leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded calmly. She thinks tomorrow ends your relationship, she said. So let her think that. That was the moment the wedding stopped being something we were trying to save and became something entirely different. By midnight, the three of us were sitting around my dining table with laptops open and legal pads covered in notes. No yelling, no revenge fantasies, just strategy. As a contracts attorney, I understood two things very clearly. People like my mother relied on confusion, and confusion disappeared the moment documentation entered the room. Every canceled vendor had records. Every payment reversal had timestamps. Every email left a trail. Serena had already spent 2 weeks quietly preparing because, unlike me, she recognized the danger early. The moment my mother started contacting guests privately, Serena began forwarding everything into a separate archive. Screenshots, voicemails, messages from relatives asking strange questions. Patterns. Daniel handled the practical side. While my mother believed the wedding was collapsing, he secured a smaller private venue through a colleague whose family owned a restored art gallery downtown. Clean white walls, candlelight. Enough. Room for the people who genuinely loved us. Then we made one critical decision. We wouldn't warn my mother. We would let her arrive at the empty original venue believing she had won. Meanwhile, Serena contacted every guest individually the morning of the wedding through a private digital invitation link. 87 people confirmed within 2 hours. Most were furious after seeing the evidence folder. Serena included discreetly at the bottom. Not dramatic accusations, just proof. My mother spent years controlling the narrative, because nobody ever challenged her version first. This time she wouldn't have time to rewrite anything. At 11:30 on the morning of the wedding, my mother stood in the middle of the empty lot, wearing pearl earrings and a satisfied expression. I watched her from across the street through the tinted window of Daniel's car. Guests arrived slowly at first. Confused couples stepped out carrying wrapped gifts, looking around at the bare concrete and locked gates. No flowers, no music, no ceremony arch, just wine pushing dust across the abandoned property. My mother moved gracefully through the crowd, pretending to comfort people. It's heartbreaking, I heard her tell one relative softly. I tried to warn her this would happen. Then phones started vibrating, one after another. Guests checked the private message Serena had scheduled precisely for noon. Inside was the new venue address, along with copies of my mother's emails, cancellation requests, and the medical records she illegally shared. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Not loud, worse, quiet. People stopped speaking to her. Conversations moved away from her in slow, visible waves. My aunt lowered her eyes and stepped back. Daniel's father folded the printed screenshots carefully and placed them in his coat pocket without saying a word. My mother's smile started disappearing piece by piece. Then the final car left. She stood alone in heels, sinking slightly into cracked pavement, while 90 wedding guests drove somewhere else, somewhere she wasn't invited. An hour later, I walked down the aisle, inside a candlelit gallery, while rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows. For the first time in my life, my mother had no audience left to control. The fallout spread quietly over the next few weeks. No dramatic family war, no screaming phone calls, just distance. Relatives who once defended my mother stopped answering her messages as quickly. My aunt sent me a handwritten apology admitting she had ignored years of manipulation because keeping peace felt easier than telling the truth. Even people who disliked confrontation couldn't unsee the evidence after witnessing what happened at the venue. My mother tried controlling the story at first. She told people I had turned The family against her. But every version she gave collapsed against. Screenshots, timestamps, and witnesses. Eventually, the calls stopped coming. For the first time, silence belonged to her instead of me. What hurt most wasn't losing my mother emotionally. That loss had happened years earlier. What hurt was realizing how much of my life I spent shrinking myself to avoid provoking someone committed to misunderstanding me anyway. Daniel noticed the difference before I did. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. Stopped explaining my worth like it needed legal defense. That's why stories like this matter. Because some betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from people who helped shape your voice so they could later convince you not to use it. And sometimes, revenge isn't destruction. Sometimes it's calmly removing yourself from the stage they built to humiliate you. And watching them stand there alone when the audience finally leaves. 6 months after the wedding, Daniel and I hosted a small dinner in our apartment. For the friends who helped save that, date on nothing extravagant. Homemade pasta. Candles burning low on the table. Music soft enough that conversations could breathe, naturally between pauses. At one point, Serena laughed and said, "You know, your apartment feels different now." She was right. For most of my life, I lived like someone waiting for permission to exist peacefully. Every achievement felt temporary because I expected criticism to arrive eventually and take it away. Even happiness came with tension attached to it. But distance changes people. Especially distance from cruelty disguised as family obligation. I still hear occasional updates about my mother through relatives. Apparently she tells people I abandoned her. Maybe she believes that version now. Maybe she needs to. I no longer spend energy correcting stories for people determined not to understand them. That was the real revenge in the end. Not exposing her, not humiliating her publicly, but refusing to carry the shame she spent years trying to hand me. Daniel and I are planning another ceremony next spring, smaller this time, near the ocean, with only the people who showed us what love actually looks like when control is removed from it. And sometimes late at night, I think back to that empty parking lot, to my mother standing there alone while every single guest quietly chose to walk away from her instead of me. After a lifetime of being treated like damaged goods, that was the moment I finally understood. I was never the thing that needed fixing.